What up, potty people, and welcome back to Clipped. I'm Eric, your host, and Clipped is a podcast that delivers top-notch podcast production tips, industry insights, resources, and education to help make every podcaster's life easier. My mission is to help you start, grow, and monetize your podcast. And today we're diving into a topic that is a little bit controversial, but I kind of have a hard stance on it just from working in the industry the last 6 or 7 years and from being a podcaster myself. And that's why social media doesn't help you grow your podcast. It's not the golden ticket that you think it is. And social media is great for sparking conversations and discussing content related to the things that you talk about on your podcast. But it doesn't move the needle when it comes to directly increasing podcast downloads. And honestly, the effectiveness of social media as a podcaster kind of starts to dwindle. It's almost like diminishing returns over time. So in this episode, I'm going to be discussing the reasons behind this and covering why social media isn't where you should be spending your time when it comes to growing your podcast. But don't worry, after my little soapbox, I'm going to give you 3 places and 3 things that do help for maximizing podcast growth and downloads. Okay, so social media is misaligned when it comes to podcasting. Social media platforms and podcaster cater to 2 different types of audiences, or 2 different types of consumers, rather. Social media is typically for quick dopamine hits and short form content that people want to consume quickly. They scroll through the feed. They either want to laugh or they want to be inspired. And on the other hand, podcasts offer more long form immersive content that requires some type of engagement. Yes, you can do it and listen while you're at the gym or while you're driving or cleaning your house or whatever it may be, but it does require a little bit more focus rather than just mindlessly scrolling on social media. It's 2 different types of content consumers. The next reason is platform switching. Converting a social media viewer into a podcast listener requires them to take additional steps. They have to first of all, they have to know what the podcast is called. Then they have to hop off, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, type in the name of the podcast, then click follow or click subscribe, depending on what platform you're listening on, and then scroll through the feed and start listening. Maybe, I don't know, they want to listen to the latest episode or they want to scroll all the way down and listen to the first episode. So really, it's a barrier that can deter people because, like I mentioned, people on social media, they're looking for those quick hits of dopamine. Maybe they're on a break between work, and it's just something that you can mindlessly do. Yes, on some social media platforms, you can link directly to the podcast, and I think that that's really helpful. I wish Instagram Reels did that. I wish they all did that. That would alleviate one of the steps, but it still requires work. And as you know, people don't like work. People just want everything spoon-fed to them. And so that's a little bit of a deterrent, or a lot of a deterrent, really, for me. I talk to my friends and I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's a great example of this is we share social media clips all the time, often podcast clips of different comedians' shows, whether it's Bert Kreischer, Bobby Lee, Andrew Santino, Theo. And we all love the clips. They're hilarious. But then I'll ask them oh, so did you listen to the episode that Theo did with so-and-so? And they're like, no, they don't listen to podcasts. They're not podcast listeners. Oftentimes on social media, people that consume that are social media consumers. Some of them don't even know what a podcast is or have any interest in getting into that. But I'll tell you what social media is good for in relation to your podcast. It's great for brand awareness. And while social media might not effectively drive podcast downloads, it can still play a role in building brand awareness and sparking conversations about content related to your podcast. So if you have a podcast about cooking, that's a great place to start getting involved with people and maybe posting recipes or asking them what their favorite type of cuisine is, getting threads going about different cooking techniques. That's an example of how you build content and build community around the topic of your podcast. And perhaps over time, you might be able to convert some of these people to podcast listeners after you've developed all those touch points and they're really aware of who you are. They trust you. And at that point, they might be willing to make the leap. But for driving podcast downloads specifically, no. For brand awareness and community, absolutely. So you need to be promoting your podcast in places where podcast listeners hang out. And where are those two places? Those are inside podcast listening apps and on other podcasts. And so here's what does work when it comes to specifically growing your podcast downloads. The first thing is collaboration. Collaboration with other podcasters can expose your podcast to new audiences. I relate this to the music world. I was in a band, mildly successful band for several years, like 2010 to 2014, maybe something like that. And the more that we opened for larger acts, the more people started to find out about us and dig us and want to listen to our music. The more that we had people open for us, the more those bands got exposure. And so the way you do this in the podcasting world is by guesting. By guesting on other podcasts, you're going to get exposed to that person's audience. And if it's a little bit bigger than you, than your show, even if it's not bigger than your show, by you being on there, podcast listeners are constantly craving new shows to listen to. And if you're on a show, let's say it's like one of their favorite shows, they trust that that host brought you on because you can add something that that audience will like. And guesting is a great way to get that exposure, to build some trust under your name and your brand. And it's just going to help new listeners discover your show in a niche that they're already into and that they're a part of. The next is promo swaps. So I need to get into more of this. Several of the shows that I produce do this, where they'll link up with a like-minded podcast in a similar category as theirs, and they'll do a promo swap with that podcaster. And so let's say I want to promote Anna's podcast. Anna, she's been on my show. We're in similar niches. I would script like a 30-second thing for her that she can read and drop into her show, or I could record like a 30-second ad that she could cut into her show, get the benefits of guesting, but with just a quick hit that people on both shows are going to hear. In addition to promo drops, or promo swaps rather, there's feed drops. So let's say Chris and Joe, my friends, they have a podcast that I'm a big fan of that I think my audience would get a lot of value from. I might take like their trailer, let's say they're launching a show, and drop it into my feed. So you guys would hear this trailer. I might record something like, hey guys, I want to give a shout out to Joe and Chris. They've got a new podcast out about podcast growth and monetization. Check out their trailer. That's a way for my audience to get a feel for who Joe and Chris are, to listen to that and hopefully follow. And then Joe and Chris would do the same for me. That's tested and true over time. All the top podcasters do it. It's one of the best ways to grow your audience. Cross promotion, regardless of what industry you're in, is huge. Okay, and the next one that works and will always continue to work, and it's kind of obvious, but it's quality and consistency. Your audience needs to have great experience when they listen to your podcast. Everything in your podcast needs to be on point, be organized. You want to just constantly work on improving your content. That's what I'm trying to say. And making sure that you provide a high quality audio and you're releasing consistently, so that every Wednesday morning, your fans, your audience know, hey, this episode is going to hit my inbox and I'm stoked because this person puts out a great show and they're giving me information that I want to learn about. And I think when listeners know what to expect from your show and know when to expect it go live, they're more likely to stick around and recommend your show to others. Okay, and lastly, this is my favorite part. And this is also kind of controversial. I don't know that it's controversial per se, actually, but it costs money. And that's promoting your podcast through paid advertising. And this is a surefire way to get in front of potential listeners, because you're basically feeding them your show. And my favorite place to do this is with Overcast, overcast.fm. Through Overcast, you can pay for what are called display ads. What that is when someone is listening to a targeted show that's similar to yours, your artwork will pop up in the Overcast listening app. If you didn't know, Overcast is a listening app, probably the third or fourth most popular listening app after Apple and Spotify. I think it might be third, actually, but don't quote me on that. And so when they're listening to a similar show, a visual ad will pop up promoting your podcast. And that's a great way because you're hitting people in the middle of listening to podcasts. And that's what you want to do. You want to target podcast listeners. And so they see your show and they're apt to click on it. And it's just a great way to get in front of new listeners, and it's targeted. The best thing about all this, the paid advertising sector, is that it's targeted. The next place that works is Buzzsprout ads. And Buzzsprout ads is cool because you can actually record an advertisement and they will drop it into targeted shows. And this is actually different from Overcast because it's an actual audio ad that you have to write, record, and produce, but it's targeted. You can pay per how many people you want to reach. And they've got a great program over there. I highly recommend it. That's Buzzsprout ads. The next one is Pod News, podnews.net. Pod News is actually like one of the industry leading email newsletters. It's a daily newsletter. You can buy classified ads within the Pod News newsletter. And so let's say, as of recording this today, it's July 10th. Let's say next week, I want to purchase an ad. I can write a little classified ad for my show. It's a written ad that appears in the newsletter. The classified section has like 3 or 4 additional classified ads, but it's a great place to reach podcast listeners. What's great too is that you can get in for pretty cheap with Pod News, depending on how far out you buy and depending on if those slots have already been taken. They will give you all the analytics of how many people saw your ad, who opened the email, who clicked on your ad. And so you are paying, but you're getting a lot of data behind the ad that you buy. And so love Pod News. And those are the 3, Overcast.fm, Buzzsprout ads, and Pod News. The best places to reach podcast listeners, to grow your show, to try to get more downloads. Dude, gone are the days of the wild, wild west where like you could drop a few episodes into your feed and like a month later have several thousand listeners. In all my years of producing podcasts, I've seen one client where that happened. Dude, within a couple months, they had like 40,000 downloads. And these 2 girls, they had just started like this new company and the podcast was brand new. And it just luck of the draw. I don't know, right place, right time, right niche. That's extremely rare. You know, you're going to have to do some kind of promotion, a lot of promotion actually, and it doesn't work on social media. You're going to want to reach podcast listeners where they hang out, inside podcast listening apps, on podcasts, and in newsletters that are podcast related. Again, social media, it requires so many additional steps to try to convert someone who wants this quick dopamine hit, that wants to get a little laugh in on their lunch break. It's just 2 different segments, 2 different audiences, and 2 different listener experiences, and 2 different types of content that listeners want. So social media does not work for growing your podcast. All right, guys, that is it for me today. If you want more info on how I can help you start, grow, and monetize a podcast, head on over to the podcasthaven.com. That's my production company and the ecosystem that this show Clip falls into. Hit that contact button, shoot me a message, and let's chat. Let's chat about what you're looking to do with your podcast. Maybe you don't even have a podcast and you want to start one. We can help you launch. If you're an existing podcaster, hit us up as well. We offer a full service podcast production package, and we can lead you in the right direction and hopefully start to get those downloads up and make money from your show. There's also tons of articles on the blog, posting weekly about resources, podcast education, things happening in the podcast world, equipment. I'm a big gearhead. Lots of blogs up there about the best podcast equipment for every situation. That's the podcasthaven.com. And hey, stay tuned, guys. In the next few weeks, I've got some cool guests coming up and some great additional podcasting content. That's it. Peace out.